Good morning. I don't know about you, but I'm glad to be out this morning. I'm glad that we are here, and I hope you echo those sentiments. It's always a privilege to come together and be together to worship the Lord in spirit and in truth, and also to encourage one another, to stir up one another to love and good works. I'm grateful for that opportunity. I hope you are as well. We're grateful to see our visitors. We're glad that you've come our way, and we'd invite you back at any opportunity that you may have. Tonight we'll be meeting at 6:30 for another period of worship, and then on Wednesday at 7 o'clock we'll be meeting for a period of Bible study. That's 7 p.m. on Wednesday. Nobody show up in the morning on Wednesday. Go ahead and turn to Revelation chapter 21. Revelation 21. And in verse 8, it says, "But for the cowardly and unbelieving and abominable and murderers and immoral persons and sorcerers and idolaters and all liars, their part will be in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death." For most people, I don't think I'm reading an unfamiliar passage to you this morning. And as we think about these people who their part is in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, the second death, what we would often refer to as hell, there are a lot of kinds of people that we would expect on this list. Unbelieving, murderers, fornicators, idolaters, etc. But there's one word that shows up here that really doesn't show up much elsewhere in the New Testament, and especially in the same kinds of contexts. We might liken lists like these to lists like we see in Romans chapter 1 or 1 Corinthians 6 or Galatians 5 with the lusts of the flesh. And nowhere else is this word found in those lists. I'm talking about the word cowardly. That word doesn't show up in those other lists that talk about lusts of the flesh or deeds that were done that were done by immoral people. This word doesn't really show up, and really nowhere else in the New Testament is it translated this way, cowardly. And I'd like to talk about cowardice because I do think that it is an important thing to talk about. Maybe something that we don't talk about as often. But today we're going to talk about what is it that makes a coward? Why is being a coward worthy of hellfire? And things like that. And to start off, I want to talk about some examples of cowardice. Where do we see cowardice in the Bible? How can we identify it? Even if the word may not be explicitly there, where can we see cowardice? Well, one example of cowardice, the first that jumped in my mind, can be found in Numbers chapter 13. Numbers chapter 13. And we'll start in verse 25, and we're going to read all the way through chapter 14 and verse 4. Now Moses had sent out spies to spy out the land, and it says in verse 25, when they returned from spying out the land at the end of 40 days, they proceeded to come to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the sons of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh, and they brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. Thus they told him and said, "We went into the land where you sent us, and it certainly does flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Nevertheless, the people who live in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. Amalek is living in the Negev, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites are living in the hill country, and the Canaanites are living by the sea and by the side of the Jordan." Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "We should by all means go up and take possession of it, for we will surely overcome it." But the men who had gone up with him said, "We are not able to go up against the people, for they are too strong for us." So they gave out to the sons of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, "The land through which we have gone and spying it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great size. There also we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak are part of the Nephilim, and we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight." Then all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. All of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, "Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones become plunder. Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt?" So they said to one another, "Let us appoint a leader and return to Egypt." Now, as we are reading this account, Caleb is one that speaks up, and later it also mentions that Joshua stands with him. But Caleb and Joshua, they come back from spying out the land, and they say, "We can take this land." But there are 10 spies that say, "No, we can't." And the reasons that they give is that the people are strong and many. They have fortified cities that are very large and would be difficult to take. And not to mention, there are giants among them. People who are great in size, who, compared to them, we look like grasshoppers. Now Joshua and Caleb, they disagree. They keep in mind what God has said, that God said He would help us. We can overcome. We should go up and we should take the land. But the people side with the 10 spies. The 10 spies says, "We can't do this." And as they begin to believe these 10 spies and what they report, they give into despair. They say, "We should have died in Egypt, or we should have died in the wilderness. Why is God taking us into this land just to kill us?" And so they say, "You know what? Let's go back to Egypt. Let's appoint a leader, and let's go back." The quality that we see here, though it's not explicitly stated, is they're cowards. They are afraid of this people and everything that they have to do, and that is why they are giving in to despair. Another example of cowardice is Jesus' disciples. Turn over to Matthew chapter 8. Matthew chapter 8 and verse 23. Matthew 8 verse 23, talking about Jesus, it says, "When he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. And behold, there arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was being covered with the waves. But Jesus himself was asleep. And they came to him and woke him, saying, 'Save us, Lord, we are perishing.' He said to them, 'Why are you afraid, you men of little faith?' Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the sea, and it became perfectly calm. The men were amazed and said, 'What kind of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?'" So Jesus and his disciples are sailing across the Sea of Galilee, and they get in this boat, and there comes a great storm. And the disciples are worried that they're going to die. But Jesus is asleep. And they are upset at Jesus for being asleep. Over in the parallel account in Mark 4:38, it says, "Do you not care that we are perishing?" Jesus, why are you asleep? We're about to sink here. We're about to die. and you're doing nothing. In this account, they say, "Save us, Lord." As an aside, I wonder, what in the world are they wanting him to do to save them, given their reaction later when they're amazed? But Jesus' response, he says, "Why are you afraid?" And that word that is translated "afraid" there in my translation is the same word that we read over in Revelation 21:8. It's one of the few times it's used in the New Testament. Jesus says, "Why are you being cowards, you men of little faith?" And then he gets up and he rebukes the winds and the sea. As it says over in Mark chapter 4, he tells them, "Hush, be still," or "Peace, be still." And the disciples are amazed. They say, "What kind of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?" Whatever they expected Jesus to do, it seems like it wasn't that. They didn't have the faith that they need. Jesus says they had little faith. And that caused them to be cowards in this situation. Another example we see is in John chapter 9. John chapter 9. And look at verse 18. Jesus has healed a man who is born blind. And the Jews, specifically the Pharisees, had heard of this. And they didn't believe it. They didn't believe that he had been born blind. Verse 18, it says, "The Jews then did not believe it of him that he had been blind and had received sight, until they called the parents of the very one who had received his sight, and questioned them, saying, 'Is this your son, who you say was born blind? Then how does he now see?' His parents answered them and said, 'We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But how he now sees, we do not know. Or who opened his eyes, we do not know. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself.' His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that if anyone confessed him to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. For this reason, his parents said, 'He is of age. Ask him.'" So they don't believe this story of the blind man, that he had been born blind and that Jesus had given him sight. And so, one way they could say this is, "You weren't really blind. You could see all along." They can't really deny that he was seeing now. But you weren't really born blind, so they called in the parents. And the parents said, "Well, yes, actually, we can confirm that he was born blind." Well, the next question would be, how does he see? Who healed him? Who did this? And they say, "We don't know." Well, that's not true that they don't know. At least they were informed by their son that it was this man, this Jesus, who had given him sight. And yes, they weren't there, but they knew what their son said. So it's less about what they knew. They knew that their son said that Jesus healed them. It's more about what they weren't willing to say. In what I consider to be divine commentary of it, John says they were afraid of the Jews. That's why they didn't say it was Jesus. Because they were afraid that they'd be put out of the synagogue. As I believe Brendan Ashby, when he was here, mentioned, being put out of the synagogue was not just, you don't have a place to worship now, but no, it's total social ostracism. You're no longer able to go to the market and buy from these people who are part of the synagogue. You're no longer able to function as a member of society because every single part of society hinges on Judaism. So you're on your own. But I want you to notice, not only are they afraid for themselves, but they take that a step further. They say of their son, he is of age, ask him. They put all of the liability on their son. Here's a man who, most likely, being born blind, was a social pariah his entire life, and now he has a new lease on life, and they're trying to put the onus back on him and say, well, why don't you ask him? Let him speak for himself. He can tell you what happened, knowing full well that if he tells the truth, he's going to be a social outcast once again. It's amazing to me. Again, that word coward is not used in this passage anywhere. And yet we see cowardice in the blind man's parents. Turn over to Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26 and verse 69. If you were to think of cowards in the Bible, before too long, I think you would end up here. Matthew 26, verse 69. Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him and said, "You too were with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before them all. "I do not know what you are talking about." When he had gone out to the gateway, another servant girl saw him and said to those who were there, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." And again he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." A little later the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Surely you too are one of them, for even the way that you talk gives you away." Then he began to curse and swear, "I do not know the man." And immediately a rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the word which Jesus had said, "Before a rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. When we think about Simon Peter, we don't typically think of cowardice. We think of his boldness. Peter was a guy who said what he thought, even when it wasn't really the smartest thing to say. And we might even think of Acts chapter 2, where Peter is boldly proclaiming the Christ, as we should associate that with Peter. We think about Acts chapter 4 and Acts chapter 5, where Peter is standing before the council and boldly proclaiming Jesus and saying that they put him to death. And when they say, "Stop talking about Jesus," he says, "We ought to obey God rather than men." That's what we typically think about with Peter, and rightfully so. But Peter struggled with cowardice. Not just here. I think Galatians chapter 2, where he's playing the hypocrite and going and eating with the Jews instead of eating with the Gentiles, I think that's another instance of this. But when we talk about Peter's denials here, Peter had made a bold claim to Jesus. Jesus said, "You're all going to desert me. You're all going to leave me this night." And Peter said, "No, I'm not going to desert you. I'm going to stay with you. Even if I have to die with you, I won't deny you." But of course, Jesus predicted, he said, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times this very night." Peter's fear got the best of him. You think about the idea of Peter denying Jesus 3 times. 3 times to me shows me that it wasn't really a heat of the moment kind of thing. He was making a decision. And it was a decision that he had to live with. And yes, I know Peter repented, but in this moment, he was being a coward. Turn with me to John 19. John 19 and verse 1. Pilate then took Jesus and scourged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and put a purple robe on him. And they began to come up to him and say, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and to give him slaps in the face. Pilate came out again and said to them, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you, so that you may know I find no guilt in him." Jesus then came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." So when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify! Crucify!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he made himself out to be the Son of God." Therefore, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. And he entered into the praetorium again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You do not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you, and I have authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." As a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be king opposes Caesar." Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." So they cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So then he handed him over to them to be crucified. There are different factors that placed Jesus on the cross. Pilate observed that it was envy from the Jews. Envy was the reason that they handed him over. Certainly unbelief in Jesus that he was the Messiah. Ignorance. Peter says that they did these things out of ignorance. Different factors, but one of them was cowardice. Specifically the cowardice of Pilate. Pilate pronounced multiple times, "I find no guilt in him." He was not guilty. And yet, he put Jesus on the cross because he was afraid of the people, because he was afraid of Caesar. Pilate was a coward. Cowardice put Jesus on the cross. In John 19 and verse 8, it says that Pilate became even more afraid. That implies that even before he was afraid. But then he heard that Jesus made himself out to be the Son of God, and that made him even more afraid. In Mark 15 and verse 15, it says that Pilate was wishing to satisfy the crowd. In Matthew chapter 27 and verse 24, it says that when Pilate saw that a riot was starting, he was afraid that this was going to become a big to-do, that word was going to get back to Caesar, that this guy had made himself out to be a king, and that the people were upset, the people were rioting, and that Caesar would come in and take away his governorship. And he says, "You know what? Instead of having this big mess on my hands, I'm going to do what the people asked me to do. Even though this guy's innocent, I'm going to put him to death on the cross. I'm going to give in just to avoid a riot. So let me repeat myself. Cowardice put Jesus on the cross. So in these examples of cowardice, I think we see a few things about cowardice that I'd like to point out to you, that maybe start to make us understand why it's in that list in Revelation 21 and verse 8. Cowardice makes winnable situations unwinnable. Think about the 10 spies. God had promised that He was going to give the land to the children of Israel. That was a winnable situation. And along the way, there were battles, even in the wilderness, that God had given them victory. They weren't going in blind. God had already given them great victory over Egypt. They should have known God's power. They should have known that God could overcome these people. It was a winnable situation, but because they were cowards, because they looked at the large cities and the many people and the big giants, their fear let them give in. You think about the disciples. Jesus is in their boat. They'd seen Him do great things, heal people, change water to wine, other things that He had done before this. They'd seen His power. And He was asleep as this great storm was happening. One theme that we see in the Bible is that when somebody's asleep, that means they're not worried. They shouldn't have been worried. They shouldn't have been cowardly like they were. It was going to be okay. But in their minds, this situation became unwinnable. They were going to die. Another thing about cowardice that we see is that it causes you to deny things that you know to be true. There's something to be said for standing for truth and standing on your principles. That's what we look for today. You know, midterm elections are coming up. And I think everyone, it doesn't matter which side of the aisle you're on, everyone wants somebody to stand up for what they think is right. Nobody wants somebody who is just going to sway with the wind, sway with the voters, and say, well, you know, this was how I felt, but now I feel this way. Nobody wants that. They're called waffles, flip-flops, whatever you want to call them. Nobody likes that kind of person and that kind of politician. And when we are cowards, even if we know something to be true, our fear can cause us to deny those things. Think about the blind man's parents. They knew their son was born blind, and they knew what he said. And why would they have a reason to doubt their son who is now seeing? But they didn't want to say it. Jesus knew, or rather Peter knew Jesus. Knew him quite well. And yet because he was afraid, because he was worried that he was going to be put in with Jesus and killed, he said, I don't even know him. Pilate knew that Jesus was not guilty. And yet he was willing to put him to death. That takes me to my third point. Cowardice forces you to abandon the course of action you know to be right. God told the children of Israel, go in and take the land. That's what he wanted them to do, and they knew that. And they said, nope, we can't do it. We're not doing it. We're going back to Egypt. You think about even with the disciples. Well, what was the course of action they knew to be right? Well, they're following Jesus. They knew that they should be with him, and that really they should have known that they're going to be okay with him. Instead, they panicked and even started to cast blame upon Jesus, implying a lack of concern. Parents should have vouched for their kid. The blind man's parents should have vouched for their son and stood with him, not put all the blame and put all the onus on him, to where if he makes the right decision, which he did, now he's a social outcast. Peter should have affirmed Jesus. Pilate should have had enough backbone to stand up against the people and not put Jesus to death. So you think about being a coward this morning. I hope none of us can say that we are cowardly. But ultimately, I think cowardice is in Revelation 21:8, because it is a symptom of a lack of faith. If we have faith in God and put our trust in him, we have no reason to fear. I didn't go through the Bible and count, but other people have gone through and counted, and I have reason to trust their word. That the phrase, do not fear or do not be afraid, is found in the Bible 365 different times. It's amazing. Telling us over and over, if we serve God, we have nothing to fear. And it's true. We shouldn't be afraid of the world or social ostracism or any obstacle that we have to overcome. If we have faith in God and if we're his people, we've got nothing to fear. Not even death. Even death can't conquer us. And so this morning I'd ask, where is your faith? Is your faith in God? Or are you afraid? There's no reason to be afraid. If you put your trust in Jesus, believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, repent of your sins, confess his name before men, and be baptized for the remission of sins, you will have put on Christ, you will become a disciple of Christ, and no one can take that away. You are safe in God's hands, and only you have the power to leave that situation. If you are a Christian, perhaps you have not been showing the faith in God that you should. We can pray for you on your behalf, and you can ask God to forgive you, and he will forgive you of any unfaithfulness that you may have shown. If you have any need this morning, won't you come while we stand and sing?